Doctors said the 6-month-old paralyzed baby would never recover, but this puppy proved them wrong. The hospital room was eerily silent except for the soft hum of the machines. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting a pale glow over Sarah as she sat by the tiny crib, her fingers trembling as she brushed them over her baby's motionless hand. 6-month-old Noah lay there, his small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the ventilator, his eyes closed in a sleep that felt deeper than just rest. Sarah had always dreamed of holding her baby close, feeling his warmth against her chest, watching him kick his little legs in excitement. But fate had been cruel. Instead of hearing his joyful giggles, she heard only the steady beeping of medical monitors. Instead of celebrating milestones, his first roll, his first attempt to sit, she had been given a devastating sentence. She swallowed the lump in her throat, gripping Noah's tiny fingers, searching for the faintest response. But there was none. Tears blurred her vision as she leaned down, whispering in his ear, "Mommy is here, baby. I won't let you go. I won't give up on you." But deep down, she was terrified. What if there was nothing she could do? It had all started just a few months ago. Noah had been a perfectly healthy newborn, bright-eyed, responsive, always reaching for her whenever she held him. But then, something changed. At first, it was subtle. A stiffness in his limbs, a slight delay in his movements. Sarah had brushed it off, convincing herself that all babies developed at their own pace. But when Noah stopped moving his arms altogether, her heart clenched with fear. Then came the doctor visits, the endless tests, the sleepless nights spent Googling symptoms, desperately searching for hope where there was none. And then the final blow. The neurologist's voice was calm, clinical, detached, as if he weren't about to shatter her world. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm so sorry, but your son has a rare form of infantile paralysis." Sarah had stared at him, unblinking, as the words sank into her skin like ice. "His nerves aren't sending signals to his muscles properly. He won't be able to crawl, sit, or walk. In most cases, there's little to no recovery." No, this wasn't real. This wasn't happening. "You mean he'll take longer, right?" she had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor's expression softened, but his next words shattered whatever fragile hope she had left. "I mean, he may never move at all." Sarah had felt the room spin. The air grew thick, suffocating. "No," she whispered. "No, that can't be right. He was fine. He's just a baby." David, her husband, squeezed her hand, his grip tight, as if holding onto her would keep them from falling apart. "We'll do therapy," Sarah insisted, her voice cracking. "We'll get the best specialists. There has to be something." But the doctor only shook his head, offering a kind but firm reality check. "We'll try everything we can, but medically speaking, the chances are very slim." The words rang in her ears long after they had left the hospital. Noah may never move. Noah may never recover. Noah may never have the life she had dreamed for him. That night, Sarah sat in Noah's nursery, clutching a tiny onesie against her chest, sobbing silently. She wasn't ready to accept this. She couldn't, because mothers don't give up. Days turned into weeks. The house, once filled with excitement over their baby boy, had become a place of quiet despair. Sarah tried to stay strong, but the cracks were forming. Every morning, she woke up hoping, praying, that maybe today Noah would move, maybe today he'd show a sign of improvement. But every morning, her heart shattered all over again. She would sit by his crib, gently tickling his tiny feet, whispering, "Come on, sweetheart, just a little kick, just one." But Noah's legs remained still. She'd hold his soft hands, rub his palms with her thumb, begging for even the slightest squeeze. Nothing. The doctor's words haunted her day and night. He may never move. The hopelessness wrapped around her like chains, tightening every time she saw another baby in the park. Babies who were sitting up, crawling, laughing. Why did this happen to Noah? Why her baby? David tried to be the strong one. He'd hold her at night, rubbing slow circles on her back, whispering, "We'll find a way. We always do." but she could hear the pain in his voice. They had spent thousands on therapy, on alternative treatments, on specialists who all said the same thing. It's unlikely. Don't get your hopes up. Prepare for the worst. Prepare for the worst? How could a mother prepare to watch her child suffer? How could she prepare to never see him take his first steps? One evening, Sarah sat by the window, staring blankly at the world outside. A storm was brewing, raindrops tapping against the glass. David walked in quietly, a small box in his hands. "Sarah," he said softly. She turned, her face void of expression. "Your sister sent this." She frowned, watching as he placed the box on the floor. It rustled, and then a tiny golden-furred puppy peeked out. Sarah blinked. "What is this?" she asked, her voice hollow. "She thought it might help," David said hesitantly. Sarah stared at the puppy, who wagged its tail and let out a tiny yelp. Help? How could anything help? Nothing could change Noah's fate. Nothing, or so she thought. Little did she know, this tiny creature was about to change everything. Sarah stared at the small, golden-furred puppy trembling inside the box. Its eyes were wide and curious, tail wagging slightly as it sniffed the air. She had no energy for this. Not today, not ever. How could a dog possibly make things better? "Your sister thought he might bring some comfort," David said, kneeling beside the box, stroking the puppy's soft fur. Comfort? Sarah almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Nothing could comfort her. Nothing could erase the gut-wrenching ache of watching her son lie still, day after day, unresponsive to the world around him. "We can't take care of a dog right now," she murmured, rubbing her temples. But before David could respond, the puppy let out a tiny whimper and clumsily stumbled toward her. Its small paws patted across the hardwood floor, stopping just short of where she sat. Then, without hesitation, it nuzzled its warm little body against her leg. Sarah looked down, meeting the puppy's deep brown eyes. There was something in them, something strangely comforting, almost knowing. Her throat tightened. She hadn't realized how empty her arms felt until she scooped the tiny creature up and held it against her chest. And for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than despair. Despite her initial hesitation, the puppy quickly became part of their household. It followed Sarah everywhere, curling up by her feet when she sat beside Noah's crib, watching her with those same deep, knowing eyes. David named him Max. "He's small, but he's got a big heart," he had said, scratching the puppy's ears. Sarah found herself talking to Max during the long, quiet nights when sleep refused to come. She whispered her fears, her pain, the thoughts she couldn't voice to anyone else. "I just want him to move, Max. Just once. Just to prove the doctors wrong." Max would tilt his head, as if he understood, then curl up beside her with a soft sigh. But it wasn't until a few days later that Sarah noticed something unusual. It started subtly. One afternoon, as Sarah sat beside Noah's crib, Max suddenly perked up. His ears twitched, and he stood on his tiny paws, tail stiff. Then, without warning, he jumped into the crib. "Max, no!" Sarah gasped, reaching to pull him away. But Max wasn't hurting Noah. He was nuzzling him, gently, lovingly. He licked Noah's tiny fingers, his small wet nose pressing against the baby's still hand. He let out a soft whimper, then nudged at Noah's little arm, as if urging him to respond. Sarah's heart clenched. "He doesn't move, Max," she whispered. "He can't." But Max wouldn't stop. Day after day, the puppy returned to Noah's crib, curling up beside him, nudging his little hands and feet. And every time Sarah tried to pull him away, he would whimper in protest, refusing to leave Noah's side. David noticed it too. "It's like he's trying to wake him up," he murmured one evening, watching as Max nestled against Noah's motionless legs. Sarah bit her lip. A small part of her wanted to believe it, wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, Max knew something they didn't. And then, one night, something extraordinary happened. The house was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of the baby monitor. The soft rise and fall of Noah's breathing had become a painful reminder of the stillness that gripped his tiny body. Sarah sat beside his crib, exhausted, her fingers absently stroking Max's fur as he lay curled at her feet. Max had refused to sleep anywhere else. Every night, he would climb into Noah's crib, pressing his small, warm body against the baby, as if trying to share his own life force. Tonight was no different. Sarah was drifting between sleep and wakefulness when something startled her. A sound. It wasn't a cry, not a whimper. It was something faint, a rustling noise. She opened her eyes, blinking away the haze of exhaustion. The dim glow of the nightlight cast soft shadows around the room, but everything seemed normal. Then her heart stopped. Max was inside Noah's crib, just as always, but his small paw was resting against Noah's leg. And Noah's toes, they moved. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She sat up abruptly, her pulse hammering in her ears. Did she imagine it? With trembling hands, she leaned closer, her eyes fixed on her son's tiny foot. "Come on, baby. Just one more time." Max let out a small whimper and nudged Noah's arm again, licking his fingers gently. And then, Noah's fingers twitched. Sarah let out a sharp gasp. A movement. A real, undeniable movement. Tears filled her eyes as she stared at her son's little hand, waiting, praying for another sign. Noah remained still, but Sarah had seen it. She knew what she saw. Her son had moved, and the puppy had been the reason why. The next morning, Sarah rushed Noah to the hospital. "I saw him move," she told the doctors, her voice shaking with urgency. His toes curled, his fingers twitched. It happened. The lead pediatric neurologist, Dr. Matthews, studied her with careful eyes before sighing. "Sarah, I know you want to believe. I don't just believe it. I saw it. I know my son." Dr. Matthews exchanged a glance with the nurses before gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Spontaneous muscle twitches aren't uncommon," he said in a soothing tone. "It could be a reflex. It doesn't mean Noah is recovering." Sarah clenched her fists. A reflex? No, this was different. She had spent 6 months watching her son's unmoving body. She knew every inch of his stillness. This wasn't a reflex, but no one believed her. That night, as Sarah sat beside Noah's crib, her heart ached with frustration. Max, as if sensing her pain, whimpered softly. He jumped into Noah's crib again, curling against the baby's fragile body. His tiny paws rested against Noah's chest as he let out another soft, insistent whimper. And as Sarah watched through tear-filled eyes, she saw it again. Noah's tiny fingers twitched. This time, Sarah didn't just see it. She felt it. A warmth spread through her chest, a flicker of something she hadn't dared feel in a long time. Hope. Max knew. He had known all along. And deep in her heart, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. Because if her son could move once, he could move again. Sarah no longer doubted what she had seen. Noah was moving. Maybe not much, maybe only in tiny, almost imperceptible ways, but it was happening. And the one pushing him, the one who refused to give up, was Max. The doctors didn't believe her. They dismissed it as involuntary reflexes. But Sarah had spent 6 months watching her child lie motionless. She knew the difference. And she wasn't about to let the world convince her otherwise. So that night, as Max curled up beside Noah once again, Sarah decided to do something she hadn't done before. She let it happen. She watched carefully as the puppy pressed his tiny body against Noah's legs, nuzzling his arms, licking his fingers. And every time he did, there was a faint response. A twitch here, a flicker there. Something was changing. A thought crossed her mind, wild and impossible. What if Max is helping him? She bit her lip, her heart pounding. Then, with careful hands, she lifted Noah's tiny palm and placed it on Max's soft fur. First, nothing happened. Sarah held her breath, waiting. And then, Noah's fingers curled, ever so slightly. But it was there. It was real. Sarah sobbed. "Oh my God, Noah." Max let out a tiny bark, as if celebrating the moment. That was when Sarah made a decision. If the doctors wouldn't help her son, then she would find another way. Max wasn't just a puppy. He was Noah's therapy. And together they were going to prove everyone wrong. Sarah threw herself into this new hope. Every morning, she let Max spend time with Noah, nudging his arms, licking his hands, snuggling beside him. Every afternoon, she guided Noah's fingers to Max's fur, encouraging even the smallest movements. At first, the progress was agonizingly slow. A slight twitch, a tiny flutter of his toes. But then, one evening, as Max licked Noah's cheek, his entire hand moved. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. "David, come here. Look." David rushed into the room, his eyes widening as he saw Noah's small fingers wrap, around a lock of Max's fur. For the first time in 6 months, David's face broke into a smile. "He's getting stronger," Sarah whispered, tears falling freely. "Max is helping him." David kneeled beside her, his voice shaking. "Then we don't stop." They didn't. Day after day, Sarah and Max worked with Noah. They massaged his arms, played soft music, let Max rest against him, letting his warmth seep into Noah's fragile limbs. And slowly, miraculously, Noah responded. The doctors still dismissed it. They called it wishful thinking. They said there was no medical explanation. But Sarah didn't need an explanation. She had something stronger than science. She had a mother's belief. She had a puppy's love. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The house was silent except for the soft breathing of Noah as he lay in his crib. His tiny fingers now more relaxed, more alive than they had ever been. It had been weeks of careful, patient effort. Sarah and Max working together, believing in the impossible. Sarah had seen little changes every day. A flex of his fingers, a slight movement in his wrist. But nothing prepared her for what was about to happen next. That night, she was sitting beside Noah, stroking his tiny hand as Max curled up beside him as usual. The puppy, ever determined, rested his paw on Noah's leg, just as he always did. Sarah sighed, exhaustion creeping into her bones. "I don't know if it's enough, Max," she whispered, doubt creeping in. "What if I'm wrong?" Then it happened. A small whimper escaped Max's mouth as he nudged Noah's arm. And Noah moved his arm. Not a twitch, not a reflex, a real, undeniable movement. Sarah's breath caught. She leaned closer, her heart hammering in her chest. Then Noah's tiny leg shifted. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Oh my God, Noah!" Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with disbelief. Max barked excitedly, wagging his tail as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to cover her mouth. "David! David! Come here!" she cried out, her voice cracking. David rushed into the room, panic flashing across his face. "What is it? What's wrong?" Sarah couldn't even speak. She just pointed at Noah. And then, as if proving that it wasn't a fluke, Noah lifted his arm again. David froze. His eyes widened. "No, that's..." Before he could finish his sentence, Noah's leg kicked. For the first time in 6 months, their son was moving. Sarah burst into sobs, clutching David's arm as they watched in absolute shock. Max barked again, bouncing on his paws, as if saying, "See? I told you." David, usually the logical one, the one who always looked for explanations, dropped to his knees. It's a miracle." And for the first time since their world had shattered 6 months ago, Sarah believed it too. The next morning, Sarah and David rushed Noah to the hospital. This time, they weren't pleading. This time, they had proof. The moment Dr. Matthews entered the room, Sarah placed Noah on the examination table. "Watch," she said, her voice steady. She set Max beside him, just like always. And then Max did what he always did. He pressed his small paw against Noah's leg, gave a soft whimper, and nuzzled his cheek. And right in front of the doctors, nurses, and an entire room full of disbelieving professionals, Noah's tiny hand reached for Max. The room fell silent. A nurse gasped. A doctor dropped his clipboard. Dr. Matthews' mouth opened, but no words came out. He shook his head in disbelief, stepping closer, his voice barely above a whisper. That's That's impossible. Sarah let out a breathless laugh through her tears. And yet, it's happening. Dr. Matthews knelt beside the baby, running tests, checking reflexes, looking for answers. But there were none. There's no medical explanation for this, he finally admitted, shaking his head. Paralysis doesn't just disappear. Nerve damage doesn't heal like this. But, he turned to Max, finally realizing the truth. Somehow, this puppy did what medicine couldn't. Sarah smiled through her tears, hugging Max close to her chest. I told you, she whispered, looking at her son. He's our miracle. And for the first time in months, as Noah reached out his tiny hands for the puppy who had never given up on him, Sarah knew her son was going to be okay. Because sometimes the greatest healers aren't doctors. Sometimes they have 4 paws, a wagging tail, and a heart big enough to defy science itself. The days that followed were nothing short of astonishing. Sarah and David spent every waking moment watching Noah, afraid that it was all a dream, afraid that somehow this miracle would slip away. But it didn't. With every passing day, Noah grew stronger. His once limp arms now reached out with purpose. His legs, once lifeless, now twitched and kicked, responding to Max's playful nudges. The doctors were still stunned, unable to explain the sudden transformation. It's unheard of, Dr. Matthews murmured during one of Noah's checkups, shaking his head in disbelief. Children with this level of paralysis don't just start moving again. But Noah was proving them all wrong. Then came the moment no one expected. It was a quiet evening in the living room. The family sat on the floor, as they had done so many nights before, encouraging Noah to move, to interact. Max was right beside him, tail wagging, eyes full of determination. And then, Noah leaned forward. Sarah's heart stopped. David froze. Noah placed his hands on the floor, his tiny fingers gripping the rug. Max let out a soft bark, stepping back as if giving Noah space. Then, with every ounce of strength his little body could muster, Noah pushed himself up. Sarah let out a sharp breath, hands flying to her mouth. Noah! Oh my God! Then, he lifted his knee. His tiny body wobbled, uncertain but determined. Max let out an encouraging whimper, stepping closer, nudging Noah's side. And then, in an impossible moment, defying every doctor's prediction, every medical explanation, Noah took his first step. A shaky, uncertain, yet absolutely miraculous step. Sarah let out a sob. David grabbed her hand, his own eyes wide with shock, tears streaming down his face. Then, a second step. Max barked excitedly, bouncing beside Noah, as if cheering him on. And then a third. Sarah collapsed into tears, reaching out to her son, holding him as though she'd never let go. You did it, she sobbed, pressing kisses to his head. Oh, my sweet boy, you did it. David wrapped his arms around both of them, his voice shaking. He's walking. Our boy is walking. And Max, the tiny puppy who refused to give up, sat beside them, his tail wagging, his eyes bright, because he had known all along. He had seen what no one else could. And now the world would see it too. Sarah and David weren't the only ones who witnessed the impossible. Someone had recorded the moment on their phone. Within hours, the video had spread like wildfire. News stations picked it up. Social media exploded. A paralyzed baby takes his first steps with the help of his puppy. The world was in awe. Doctors debated. Scientists searched for answers. But no one could deny what they saw. A baby who had once been written off. A child who was told he would never walk again, had taken his first steps. And at his side, every step of the way, was a tiny, devoted puppy. People from all over the world poured out their emotions in comments, messages, and emails. I cried watching this. This is a true miracle. That puppy didn't just help him walk. He saved his life. Reporters showed up at their doorstep. The family was invited to talk shows, medical panels, even therapy research programs. Everyone wanted to know, how did this happen? But Sarah only had one answer. She looked at Max, the little dog who had never lost hope, and smiled through her tears. Because love heals, and sometimes that love comes on four legs. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, after the news coverage faded, and the world moved on to the next big story, one thing remained unchanged: the bond between Noah and Max. Max was no longer just a puppy. He was a guardian, a best friend, a lifeline. Wherever Noah went, Max followed. At night, when nightmares of hospital rooms and cold, sterile machines haunted Noah's dreams, Max would nuzzle close, his warm body providing comfort no medicine ever could. During the day, as Noah's legs grew stronger and his steps became more confident, Max was always there, his fluffy tail wagging, his bright eyes watching with pride. They had been through the impossible together, and nothing would ever break them apart. Doctors called it a medical mystery. Scientists searched for explanations. But Sarah and David? They simply called it love. Because somehow, in ways no one could explain, a tiny abandoned puppy had done what even the greatest doctors in the world couldn't. He had given Noah a future, and he had done it simply by believing in him. As the video of Noah's miraculous first steps continued to spread, something unexpected happened. Parents of children with disabilities reached out, sharing their own struggles and hopes. Animal shelters saw a rise in adoptions, people inspired by Max's story, wanting to give a second chance to animals that others had overlooked. Therapists and doctors began researching the impact of animal-assisted therapy, looking at Max's role in Noah's recovery as a case study that could change the future of medicine. The world had seen something extraordinary, and it had reminded people of something so simple yet so powerful. Love has no limits. It crosses species, defies logic, and heals in ways science cannot always explain. And sometimes, the most profound miracles come not from medicine, but from the pure, unwavering love of a loyal heart. So the next time you see an animal in need, the next time you witness a soul that the world has written off, remember Noah, remember Max, and remember that sometimes all it takes to change a life is believing in a miracle before anyone else can see it. As Sarah held Noah in her arms, watching him take confident steps across the living room, she whispered a truth she had come to understand through this journey. Miracles aren't always loud. Sometimes, they come in the form of a tiny heartbeat, a wagging tail, and an unshakable belief that love can heal what the world says is broken. The world had doubted. The doctors had given up. But Max had never stopped believing. And that belief had changed everything. If the story touched your heart, share it. Because somewhere out there, a family is struggling. A child is fighting an impossible battle. An animal waits in a shelter, longing for a second chance. And maybe, just maybe, this story will remind someone that miracles happen when love is given a chance. Would you believe in a miracle if you saw one? You just did. Now pass it on. Red Heart.